The Maginot Line, named after the French Minister of War André Maginot, was a line of concrete fortifications, obstacles, and weapon installations that France constructed on the French side of its borders with Switzerland, Germany and Luxembourg during the 1930s. The line did not extend through to the English Channel because the French military did not want to offend Belgium given its policy of neutrality. The line was a response to France's experience in World War I and was constructed during the run-up to World War II. Shortly after the Locarno Conference that gave rise to a fanciful and optimistic Locarno spirit, the French established the fortification to give their army time to mobilize in the event of attack, and allow French forces to move into Belgium for a decisive confrontation with Germany. The success of static, defensive combat in World War I was a key influence on French thinking. French military experts extolled the Maginot Line as a work of genius, believing it would prevent any further invasions from the east. While the Maginot Line was impervious to most forms of attack and had state-of-the-art living conditions for garrisoned troops, air conditioning, comfortable eating areas and underground railways, it proved strategically ineffective during the Battle of France. Instead of attacking directly, the Germans invaded through the Low Countries, bypassing the line to the north, while the French and British officers at the time anticipated this, and carried out plans to form an aggressive front cutting across Belgium and theoretically connecting to the Maginot Line when Germany invaded Holland and Belgium. The French line was weak near the Ardennes forest since they considered it unlikely that the Germans would be able to traverse the rough terrain in this region. The German army took advantage of this to split the French-British defensive front. The Allied forces to the north were forced to evacuate at Dunkirk, leaving the forces to the south unable to mount an effective resistance to the German invasion, and France surrendered in about 6 weeks. Planning and construction. The defences were first proposed by Marshal Joffre. He was opposed by modernists such as Paul Reynaud and Charles de Gaulle, who favoured investment in armour and aircraft. Joffre had support from Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, and there were a number of reports and commissions organised by the government. It was André Maginot who finally convinced the government to invest in the scheme. Maginot was another veteran of World War I. He became the French Minister of Veteran Affairs and then Minister of War. In January 1923, after Germany defaulted on reparations, the French Premier Raymond Poincaré had French troops march in and occupy the Ruhr region of Germany in response. During the ensuing Ruhrkampf between the Germans and the French that lasted until September 1923, Britain condemned the French occupation of the Ruhr, and a period of sustained Francophobia broke out in Britain, with Poincaré being vilified in Britain as a cruel bully punishing Germany with unreasonable reparations demands. The British, who openly championed the German position on reparations, applied intense economic pressure on France to change its policies towards Germany. At a conference in London in 1924 to settle the Franco-German crisis caused by the Ruhrkampf, the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald successfully applied strong pressure on the French Premier Édouard Herriot to make concessions to Germany. The British diplomat Sir Eric Phipps, who attended the conference, commented afterwards that the London conference was for the French man in the street, one long Calvary, as he saw M. Herriot abandoning one by one the cherished possessions of French preponderance on the Reparations Commission, the right of sanctions in the event of German default, the economic occupation of the Ruhr, the French-Belgian Railroad Régie, and finally, the military occupation of the Ruhr within a year. The great conclusion that was drawn in Paris after the Ruhrkampf and the 1924 London Conference was that France could not make unilateral military moves to uphold Versailles, as the resulting British hostility to such moves were too dangerous to the Republic. Beyond that, the French were well aware of the contribution of Britain and its dominions to the victory of 1918, and French decision-makers believed that they needed Britain's help to win another war. The French could only go so far with alienating the British. From 1871 onwards, French elites had concluded that France had no hope of defeating Germany on its own, and France would need an alliance with another great power to defeat the Reich. 1927. Allied Control Commission abolished in 1927. The Allied Control Commission, which was responsible for ensuring that Germany complied with Part 5 of the Treaty of Versailles, was abolished as a goodwill gesture reflecting the spirit of Locarno. When the Control Commission was dissolved, the commissioners in their final report issued a blistering statement, stating that Germany had never sought to abide by Part 5 and the Reichswehr had been engaging in covert rearmament all through the 1920s. Under the Treaty of Versailles, France was to occupy the Rhineland region of Germany until 1935. But in fact the last French troops left the Rhineland in June 1930 in exchange for Germany accepting the Young Plan. As long as the Rhineland was occupied by the French, the Rhineland served as a type of collateral under which the French would annex the Rhineland in the event of Germany breaching any of the articles of the treaty, such as rearming in violation of Part 5. This threat was powerful enough to deter successive German governments all through the 1920s from attempting any overt violation of Part 5. French plans as developed by Marshal Ferdinand Foch in 1919 were based on the assumption that in the event of a war with the Reich, the French forces in the Rhineland were to embark upon an offensive to seize the Ruhr. A variant of the Foch plan had been used by Poincaré in 1923 when he ordered the French occupation of the Ruhr. French plans for an offensive in the 1920s were realistic, as Versailles had forbidden Germany conscription, and the Reichswehr was limited to 100,000 men. Once the French forces left the Rhineland in 1930, this form of leverage with the Rhineland as collateral was no longer available to Paris, which from then on had to depend on Berlin's word that it would continue to abide by the terms of the Versailles and Locarno treaties, which stated that the Rhineland was to stay demilitarized forever. Given that Germany had engaged in covert rearmament with the cooperation of the Soviet Union starting in 1921 and that every German government had gone out of its way to insist on the moral invalidity of Versailles, claiming it was based upon the so-called Kriegsschutzlüge that Germany started the war in 1914. The French had little faith that the Germans would willingly allow the Rhineland's demilitarized status to continue forever, and believed that at some time in the future Germany would rearm in violation of Versailles, reintroduce conscription and remilitarize the Rhineland. The decision to build the Maginot Line in 1929 was a tacit French admission that without the Rhineland as collateral Germany was soon going to rearm, and that the terms of Part 5 had a limited lifespan. Germany's economic superiority. After 1918, Germany's economy was 3 times larger than France's. Germany had a population of 70 million compared to France's 40 million, and the French economy was hobbled by the need to reconstruct the enormous damage of World War I, while German territory had seen little fighting. Given these facts, French military chiefs were dubious about France's ability to win another war against Germany on its own, especially an offensive war. Moreover, French decision-makers were very well aware that the victory of 1918 had been achieved because the British Empire and the United States were France's allies in the war, and that the French would have been defeated on their own, with the United States isolationist and Britain stoutly refusing to make the continental commitment to defend France on the same scale as in World War I. The prospects of Anglo-American assistance in the event of another war with Germany appear to be doubtful at best. Versailles did not call for military sanctions in the event of the Germany remilitarizing the Rhineland or breaking Part 5, while Locarno committed Britain and Italy to come to France's aid in the event of a flagrant violation of the Rhineland's demilitarized status. Without defining what was a flagrant violation, both the British and Italian governments refused in subsequent diplomatic talks to define what would be a flagrant violation of Locarno, which led the French to place little hope in Anglo-Italian help if Germany should remilitarize the Rhineland. Given the diplomatic situation in the late 1920s, the Quai d'Orsay informed the government that French military planning should be based on a worst-case scenario that France would fight the next war against Germany without the help of Britain or the United States. France had an alliance with Belgium and with the states of the Cordon Sanitaire, as the French alliance system in Eastern Europe was known. Although the alliances with Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania and Yugoslavia were appreciated in Paris, it was widely understood that this was no compensation for the lack of alliances with Britain and the United States. The French military was especially insistent that the disparities between Germany's 70 million people and France's 40 million made an offensive war of maneuver of swift advances suicidal from the French viewpoint, as there would always be far more German divisions than French divisions, and what was needed was a defensive strategy to counter Germany's larger population. The French assumption was always that Germany would not go to war until conscription was returned to Germany, which would allow the German army to take advantage of the Reich's numerical superiority, without the natural defensive barrier provided by the Rhine River. French generals argued that France needed a new defensive barrier made of concrete and steel to replace it. The power of properly dug-in defensive trenches had been amply demonstrated during World War I, when a few soldiers manning a single machine gun post could kill hundreds of the enemy in the open, and therefore building a massive defensive line with subterranean concrete shelters was the most rational use of French manpower. The American historian William K. Law wrote that given the diplomatic conditions of 1929 and what was known to be probable about the future in 1929, the decision to build the Maginot Line was nowhere near as irrational and stupid as often made out to be. And in fact, building the Maginot Line was a sensible response to the problems that would be created by the coming French withdrawal from the Rhineland in 1930. Part of the rationale for the Maginot Line stemmed from the severe French losses during the First World War, and their effects on French demographics. The drop in the national birth rate during and after the war, resulting in a national shortage of young men, created an echo effect in the generation that provided the French conscript army in the mid-1930s. Faced with inadequate personnel resources, French planners had to rely more on older and less fit reservists, who would take longer to mobilize, and would diminish French industry because they would leave their jobs. Static defensive positions were therefore intended not only to buy time, but also to defend an area with fewer and less mobile forces. In practice, France deployed about twice as many men, 36 divisions, for the defense of the Maginot Line in Alsace and Lorraine, whereas the opposing German Army Group C only contained 19 divisions, or less than 1/7 of the total force committed in the Manstein Plan for the invasion of France. Reflecting memories of World War I, the French General Staff had developed the concept of la puissance du feu, namely the power of artillery, heavily dug in and sheltered by concrete and steel to inflict devastating losses on an attacking force. War of long duration. French planning for war with Germany was always based on the assumption that the war would be la guerre de longue durée, a long, drawn-out struggle in which the superior economic resources of the Allies would gradually grind the Germans down. The fact that the Wehrmacht embraced the strategy of blitzkrieg with the vision of swift wars in which Germany would win quickly via one knockout blow was a testament to the fundamental soundness of the concept of la guerre de longue durée. Germany had the largest economy in Europe, but Germany lacked many of the raw materials necessary for a modern industrial economy and the ability to feed its own large population. Thus the la guerre de longue durée strategy called for the French to halt the expected German offensive meant to give the Reich a swift victory. Afterwards, there would ensue an attritional struggle. Once the Germans were exhausted, France would begin an offensive to win the war. The Maginot Line was intended to block the main German blow if it should come in eastern France, and better still, to direct the main blow to come through Belgium, where French forces would meet and stop the Germans. Once that happened, it was expected that the Germans would stage a series of costly offensives whose failures would sap the strength of the Reich, while the French would wage a total war in which the entire resources of French society would be mobilized for the war. Besides, for the demographic reasons, an initially defensive strategy served the needs of French diplomacy towards Great Britain. The French imported a third of their coal from Britain, and 32% of all imports that arrived in French ports were carried by British ships. Of French trade, 35% was with the British Empire, while the majority of the tin, rubber, jute, wool and manganese the French used came from the British Empire. Finally, 55% of all imports from all countries arrived in France via the ports on the English Channel like Calais, Le Havre, Cherbourg, Boulogne, Gep, Saint-Malo and Dunkirk. Furthermore, Germany had to import most of its iron, rubber, oil, bauxite, copper and nickel, and so a naval blockade could have a devastating effect on the German economy. For economic reasons, the success of the strategy of la guerre de longue durée would at very least require Britain to maintain a benevolent neutrality, and better yet, to enter the war on France's side, as British sea power could protect the crucial French imports while depriving Germany of hers. A defensive strategy based on the Maginot Line was an excellent way of demonstrating to Britain France's intentions not to start a war, but only to go to war in the event of German aggression, a situation that would make it more likely that Britain would enter the war on France's side. The line was built in several phases from 1930 by the STG, overseen by CORF. The main construction was largely completed by 1939, at a cost of around 3 billion French francs. The line stretched from Switzerland to Luxembourg, and a much lighter extension was extended to the Strait of Dover after 1934. The original line construction did not cover the area chosen by the Germans for their first challenge, which was through the Ardennes in 1940, a plan known as Fall Gelb, due to the neutrality of Belgium. The location of this attack, because of the Maginot Line, was through the Belgian Ardennes forest, which is off the map to the left of Maginot Line Sector 6. Purposes. The Maginot Line was built to fulfill several purposes: to avoid a surprise attack and to give the alarm, to cover the mobilization of the French army, to save manpower, to protect Alsace and Lorraine and their industrial basin, to be used as a basis for a counter-offensive, to push the enemy to circumvent it while passing by Switzerland or Belgium, to hold the enemy while the main army could be brought up to reinforce the line, to show non-aggressive posture, and compel the British to help France if Germany invaded Belgium, to push Belgium into the war, by leaving it open to an attack from Germany. Manning. Maginot Line fortifications were manned by specialist units of fortress infantry, artillery and engineers. The infantry manned the lighter weapons of the fortresses, and formed units with the mission of operating outside if necessary. Artillery troops operated the heavy guns, and the engineers were responsible for maintaining and operating other specialist equipment, including all communications systems. All these troops wore distinctive uniform insignia and considered themselves among the elite of the French army. During peacetime, fortresses were only partly manned by full-time troops. They would be supplemented by reservists who lived in the local area, and who could be quickly mobilized in an emergency. Full-time Maginot Line troops were accommodated in barracks built close by the fortresses. They were also accommodated in complexes of wooden housing adjacent to each fortresses, which was more comfortable than living inside. but which were not expected to survive wartime bombardment. Training was carried out at a fortress near the town of Bitcher. This particular one was built in a military training area and could carry out live firing exercises. This was impossible elsewhere, as the other parts of the line were located in civilian areas.